Donald Trump did not merely issue threats directed at Canada and Greenland. He said aloud what most leaders before him had assumed no one would ever dare to state openly. And Canada understood immediately this was not a joke, nor was it political theater. It was a test of how far threats could be pushed in a world long accustomed to believing that, at the last moment, restraint would ultimately prevail. Canada did not wait to see the outcome. It acted. Greenland is not a vague symbol. It is a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. It falls under NATO protection and occupies a pivotal position in Arctic security, from shipping lanes and energy resources to future military deployments, all of which are closely tied to Canada's own interests. When Donald Trump spoke openly about Greenland as something that could be taken, purchased, or pressured into submission, those were not idle words. He was sending a far more dangerous signal that national sovereignty could become a bargaining chip if sufficient pressure were applied. For Canada, that was a clear warning bell, because if Greenland, protected by NATO and backed by Europe, could be spoken of in such terms, then Canada's own sovereignty could just as easily be treated as a negotiable condition. The logic is unmistakable. If today it is Greenland, then tomorrow, who will it be?
The point was to send a message. To send a message to Canada and to the rest of the world that what the United States is and has become is a gangster, klepto state that will do what they want to do and shake down whoever they want to shake down. Gangster fascism. You know what he said at this press conference he gave was that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. This was sending a message. And it's a clear message to Canada. He said, "We will secure our borders, we will stop the terrorists, we will defend our citizens against all threats, foreign and domestic. This operation should serve as a warning to anyone who would threaten American sovereignty." Well, clearly Venezuela wasn't threatening American sovereignty. Venezuela was doing its own thing.
Canada did not respond with loud outrage. It responded by choosing its position. Prime Minister Mark Carney understands that raised voices change nothing. What matters is who you stand with, where you stand, and how quickly clear boundaries are drawn. By standing with Denmark, Canada made its position unmistakably clear. Borders are not bargaining chips. Territorial integrity is not empty rhetoric. And the Arctic is not a place where coercion can be applied through threats. This was not a symbolic gesture of support. It was a declaration of alignment, legal, political, and strategic. Carney also understands something Trump consistently underestimates. No country can successfully confront coercion on its own. That is why Europe has always been the top priority. Long before the Greenland issue was raised publicly, Carney had been quietly laying the groundwork across European capitals, restoring trust, reinforcing shared norms, and rebuilding Canada's image as a serious stabilizing partner. Those efforts paid off, as Trump's rhetoric escalated, from Ukraine to Venezuela, from Greenland to even speaking of Canada as though it were a 51st state. Europe did not remain silent. At a moment that would have been almost unthinkable just a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron publicly warned that Trump's threats toward Canada and its sovereignty would cause serious damage to the global order. That mattered greatly because it showed that Canada was no longer standing alone. Thanks to the alliances Carney had built, it was no longer only Canadians rejecting those statements. It was Europe's most powerful leaders speaking out together, saying that such behavior places the entire international system at risk. That is the line between isolation and deterrence, and that line does not emerge by accident.
When U.S. President Donald Trump first threatened Canadian sovereignty, few, if any, of Canada's allies came to its defense publicly. But this week, French President Emmanuel Macron brought it up as an example of the U.S. turning away from its allies and breaking international norms.
Si le Canada sera soumis à la menace de devenir le 51e État ou autre.
Every day, people wonder if Canada will be threatened with becoming the 51st state, if Greenland will be invaded. Macron was speaking to a gathering of ambassadors in Paris.
C'est le désordre le plus grand, la loi du plus fort.
We are living in a time of utter chaos. It's the law of the strongest that prevails. His comments come days after the U.S. launched a military operation in Venezuela, and as the Trump administration ramps up its pledge to take over Greenland.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations says it's all in line with the U.S.'s new national security strategy.
The hemisphere belongs to them and nobody else. They will use force if required. This is a deadly, serious challenge, not just for Canada, but for every country.
In an interview this week with the New York Times, Trump brushed aside questions about international law, saying his power is constrained only by his own morality.
Greenland did not become a focal point by chance. Before Greenland, there was Ukraine. Each time, Trump took steps that undermined Ukraine's sovereignty, whether through pressure, conditional aid, or transactional bargaining. Canada deliberately positioned itself on the opposite side, clearly and consistently. Canada did not respond with empty speeches or abstract calls to principle, but through recognition, legitimacy, and tangible presence. Canada treated Ukraine's leadership as that of a fully sovereign state, equal, legitimate, and not subject to negotiation. This established a pattern so that when the Greenland issue emerged, the response was already in place. Threats were met with alignment, coercion was countered with legitimacy, and silence was replaced by presence. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate calculation. Canada has consistently stood with those in weaker positions, and that has never been a secret to the world. Trump understands pressure. He understands how to exploit hesitation. He knows how to isolate opponents and make them feel alone. What Trump handles poorly, however, is early, coordinated resistance. Resistance that strips away his leverage before it can escalate. Canada does not wait for crises to erupt. Instead, it has proactively built a protective perimeter around itself. Europe, NATO allies, Arctic stakeholders, and now China as well. Each additional layer of alignment makes Trump's next move more costly, not only emotionally, but politically and diplomatically. The Greenland issue is not, in fact, only about Greenland. It is about the Arctic. Melting ice is opening new shipping routes that will shape future trade. Energy resources are becoming increasingly accessible. Military positioning in the far north is growing ever more decisive. Canada sits at the very center of that emerging landscape. By defending Greenland's sovereignty, Canada is defending a principle that directly shields its own Arctic interests. The message being sent is not loud, but it is unmistakably firm. The Arctic is governed by rules, alliances, and shared norms, not by whoever speaks the loudest. And that signal does not stop with Denmark.
Well, you know the coded language of weapons of mass destruction, giving a U.S. regime the ability to go in and invade in another country. And Prime Minister Trudeau tried and tried again to reassure the Americans, to use facts, to show that our border was not flooding the Americans with fentanyl, but it didn't matter. It was about establishing a narrative. Kash Patel of the FBI then ramped it up. He started to talk about needing to protect the American border from the Canadian terrorist threat. He talked about hundreds of terrorists coming across the border. It was ridiculous. We know that. But did you hear the New York Times and the Washington Post and the CNN and the blah blahs on the evening talk show saying, what the heck is he talking about, this threat from Canada? Donald Trump was establishing a narrative of threat. And then that threat was elevated again by Kristi Noem, who started to talk about the threat of the northern border, that's us, bringing criminal gangs, El Salvadorian gangs across the border to terrorize poor American citizens. We knew that was ridiculous. But again, the narrative of threat, and now Donald Trump is telling the world that he can go wherever he wants.
Canada has never issued threats toward Trump, and it has never needed to. Instead, Canada demonstrated something Trump instinctively understands very well. Every time you escalate pressure, you only push your opponents closer together. Every time you raise your voice in threat, you inadvertently strengthen the coalition forming against you. That is not leverage. It is self-inflicted constraint. The developments surrounding Greenland show that pressure no longer isolates Canada. On the contrary, it rallies the world to its side. For decades, Canada's instinctive response was to de-escalate, to smooth over differences, avoid confrontation, and trust that goodwill would eventually be reciprocated. Trump fundamentally altered that calculation. From trade wars to annexation-style rhetoric, ambiguity is no longer a safe option. Carney adjusted Canada's approach not through loud declarations or theatrical gestures, but by building alliances strong enough to speak for themselves. The Greenland episode was not a masterstroke by Trump. It was a miscalculation, because it forced Canada, and many others, to abandon the assumption that restraint will always be rewarded. Canada did not escalate the confrontation. It simply, quietly narrowed Trump's options. By the time Trump recognized what was happening, Canada was no longer reacting to events. It was shaping them. And in geopolitics, that is what checkmate looks like. Before you go, if you're interested in clear-eyed, candid analysis of global politics and Canada's role on the world stage, follow Canadian Insight. This channel was created to cut through the noise and explain what truly matters, clearly, calmly, and without embellishment.